The summer of 1991 was scorching hot in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the kind of heat that made the air thick and heavy, where the smell of garbage and decay seemed to cling to everything. For most residents, it was just another uncomfortable stretch of weather to endure. But for one man living in a rundown apartment building on North 25th Street, the heat was perfect. It masked the stench that had been growing stronger with each passing week. That man was Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, and by July of that year, he had already killed 15 people, but nobody knew that yet. To his neighbors, he was just the quiet guy who worked the night shift at a chocolate factory. Polite when you passed him in the hallway, always kept to himself, never caused any trouble, the kind of person you'd forget about the moment you walked away. But inside apartment 213, behind a door that was always locked, Jeffrey Dahmer had created something that would haunt investigators for decades. It wasn't just the bodies, it wasn't just the torture, it was the methodical, calculated way he had turned murder into a routine. Like clocking in for work, except his work involved dismembering human beings and keeping their skulls as trophies. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer isn't just about one man's descent into unimaginable evil. It's about how a society can fail so completely that 17 young men can disappear without anyone noticing. It's about racism, homophobia, and a justice system that looked the other way when the victims were poor, black, and gay. It's about warning signs that were ignored, opportunities that were missed, and a monster who was allowed to hunt for over a decade. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents, Lionel and Joyce, were typical middle-class Americans trying to build a life together. By all accounts, Jeffrey was a normal, happy child for the first few years of his life. He laughed, he played, he showed affection. There are home movies of him as a toddler, giggling and running around the yard, looking like any other kid. But something changed when Jeffrey was 6 years old. He underwent surgery to repair a hernia, and according to his father, something inside him shifted after that. The bright, social child began to withdraw. The easy smiles disappeared, replaced by a blank, emotionless stare that would follow him for the rest of his life. His personality became flat, distant. He stopped connecting with people. Around the same time, Jeffrey's family life began to crumble. His parents fought constantly, their arguments echoing through the house day and night. His mother, Joyce, struggled with mental health issues and was often medicated, leaving her detached and unavailable. His father, Lionel, buried himself in work and graduate school, physically present but emotionally absent. When Jeffrey was 5, his younger brother David was born, and Jeffrey immediately resented him as competition for what little attention his parents had to give. The family moved frequently during Jeffrey's early childhood, never staying in one place long enough for him to form lasting friendships. By the time they settled in Bath, Ohio, Jeffrey was already showing signs of the darkness that would define his life. He became fascinated with roadkill, collecting dead animals and bringing them home. He would spend hours in the woods behind their house, finding decomposing carcasses and studying them. But it wasn't just curiosity. Jeffrey began performing crude experiments on these dead animals. He would cut them open, remove their organs, and preserve the bones. He learned how to clean skeletons using acid and bleach. He would impale animal heads on sticks and mount them on trees like grotesque decorations. Neighbors later recalled seeing him with jars full of animal parts preserved in formaldehyde, like a twisted science project. His fascination with death extended beyond just animals. Jeffrey began collecting insects, especially large ones, and preserving them in jars. He created what he called a little cemetery in the backyard, complete with grave markers topped with animal skulls. To anyone watching, it should have been obvious that something was deeply wrong. But his parents were too consumed with their own problems to notice, and Jeffrey was careful to keep his darkest activities hidden. By the time he reached his early teens, Jeffrey had become completely isolated. He had no friends, no social connections, no interests beyond his morbid experiments. He was disengaged from school, tense and withdrawn at home. His parents' marriage was falling apart, and the constant fighting had created an atmosphere of chaos and instability. Jeffrey began to retreat further into his own mind, where his fantasies were becoming increasingly violent. According to Jeffrey's own later confessions, his compulsions toward necrophilia and murder began around the age of 14. He would spend hours each day lost in elaborate fantasies about killing men and having sex with their corpses. These weren't fleeting thoughts or normal teenage curiosity about death. They were detailed, obsessive scenarios that consumed most of his waking hours. The fantasies became so overwhelming that Jeffrey actually attempted to act on them when he was just 13 years old. There was a male jogger who ran past his house regularly, and Jeffrey became obsessed with him. He would watch from his bedroom window, timing the man's route, studying his habits. One day, Jeffrey hid in the bushes along the jogging path with a baseball bat, planning to knock the man unconscious and take him somewhere private. But the jogger didn't show up that day. Jeffrey waited for hours, but the man never came. It was pure chance that prevented what could have been Jeffrey's first murder, years before he actually killed anyone. The incident shows just how early his violent urges had developed and how close he came to acting on them as a child. Throughout his teenage years, Jeffrey's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started drinking heavily, sometimes showing up to school drunk. He would make strange jokes that made other students uncomfortable. He had no friends, no girlfriends, no normal teenage experiences. His parents were so focused on their deteriorating marriage that they barely noticed their son was falling apart. The divorce proceedings between Lionel and Joyce were ugly and prolonged. They fought over everything, including custody of their 2 sons. The house became a battleground, with Jeffrey caught in the middle. He later said that watching his parents' marriage implode made him question whether any human relationships were real or lasting. It reinforced his belief that people were fundamentally selfish and that emotional connections were just illusions. By his senior year of high school, Jeffrey was essentially living alone. His parents had separated, and his mother had moved out, taking his younger brother with her. His father was rarely home, leaving Jeffrey to fend for himself in the empty house. He spent his days drinking and his nights lost in increasingly violent fantasies. He was a ticking time bomb, and everyone around him was too distracted to notice. 3 weeks after his high school graduation, on June 18, 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. He was just 18 years old, significantly younger than the average age for serial killers, which researchers have determined to be around 29. The victim was Stephen Mark Hicks, also 18, who was hitchhiking to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. Jeffrey was driving around aimlessly that afternoon, probably drunk, when he spotted Stephen on the side of the road. And Stephen was shirtless, thumbing for a ride, and something about the sight of him triggered Jeffrey's violent fantasies. Jeffrey pulled over and offered Stephen a ride, but instead of taking him to the concert, he convinced him to come back to his house for a few beers. Jeffrey's parents were both out of town, so he had the house to himself. He and Stephen spent several hours together, drinking and listening to music. Jeffrey was attracted to Stephen, but when Stephen mentioned having a girlfriend, Jeffrey realized that any sexual advances would be rejected. As the afternoon wore on, Stephen said he wanted to leave to get to the concert, but Jeffrey didn't want him to leave. He couldn't let him leave. All those years of violent fantasies suddenly had a target, and Jeffrey felt compelled to act. When Stephen stood up to go, Jeffrey grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell and struck him twice in the back of the head. Stephen collapsed unconscious, but still breathing. Jeffrey then strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell. For most people, killing another human being would be traumatic, life-changing, impossible to process. But Jeffrey felt nothing. No remorse, no panic, no regret. If anything, he felt relieved. The fantasies that had tormented him for years had finally become reality, and the experience was even more satisfying than he had imagined. But now he had a body to dispose of. Jeffrey dragged Stephen's corpse to the basement and began the process of dismemberment. He had learned how to cut up animal carcasses, and he applied those same techniques to Stephen's body. He cut off the head, arms, and legs, then used a knife to strip the flesh from the bones. He packed the body parts in plastic bags and buried them in the woods behind his house. But Jeffrey wasn't done. The next day, he dug up the bags and moved them to a different location. A few weeks later, he dug them up again and used a sledgehammer to crush the bones into small pieces. He then scattered the fragments across a wooded ravine, making sure that Stephen Hicks would never be found. The murder should have been the beginning of a killing spree. Most serial killers, once they cross that line, continue killing regularly. But Jeffrey Dahmer didn't kill again for almost 10 years. During that time, he managed to convince himself and everyone around him that he was just a regular guy trying to get his life together. After high school, Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University, but he spent most of his time drinking instead of attending classes. He was so intoxicated so often that he couldn't function academically. After 2 semesters, he dropped out and returned home, where his father gave him an ultimatum: get a job or join the army. Jeffrey chose the army. In January 1979, he enlisted for a 6-year term and was stationed in Germany. For a while, it seemed like the structure and discipline might help him. He was a decent soldier when he was sober, and he managed to avoid serious trouble for the first couple of years, but his drinking problem only got worse. Jeffrey's fellow soldiers later described him as a loner who would disappear for hours at a time. He would drink alone in his barracks room, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness. He had no friends, no social life, no interests beyond alcohol. His superiors noted that he was intelligent and capable when sober, but increasingly unreliable due to his drinking. In 1981, after just 2 years of service, Jeffrey was discharged from the Army due to his alcohol abuse. He had 4 years left on his enlistment, but his drinking had become so severe that he was considered unfit for duty, he returned to Ohio with no prospects, no skills, and no plan for his future. For the next several years, Jeffrey drifted from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to build a career or form relationships. He worked as a phlebotomist at a blood bank, which gave him access to blood samples that he would sometimes take home. He worked various factory jobs, always on the night shift, always alone. He lived with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, who was one of the few people who showed him any kindness. But even during these relatively quiet years, Jeffrey's dark urges never went away. He would cruise gay bars, not looking for companionship, but for potential victims. He would follow men home, sometimes breaking into their houses just to watch them sleep. He was arrested several times for minor offenses, but nothing that suggested he was capable of murder. The whole time, Jeffrey was fighting an internal battle. Part of him wanted to kill again, to recreate the satisfaction he had felt when he murdered Stephen Hicks, but another part of him was terrified of getting caught. He had gotten away with murder once, but he knew that if he killed again, he might not be so lucky. 9 years passed, 9 years of silence, 9 years where Jeffrey Dahmer lived quietly in Milwaukee, working mundane jobs, battling his demons in the shadows. To the outside world, he was just another face in the crowd, another struggling young man trying to find his place. But inside, those dark fantasies never left. They festered, they grew, and in 1987, they erupted once again. The gap between Stephen Hicks and his next victim wasn't unusual for serial killers. Many experts believe that first kill often happens impulsively, almost by accident. The killer gets scared, goes into hiding, tries to convince themselves it was a one-time thing. But the urge doesn't disappear. It just waits. During those 9 years, Dahmer wasn't idle. He enlisted in the army, hoping structure and discipline might quiet the voices in his head. For a while, it worked. The rigid military schedule, the constant supervision, the physical demands, they all served as distractions. But alcohol became his crutch. He drank to silence the fantasies, to numb the compulsions that gnawed at him day and night. His fellow soldiers remembered him as quiet, withdrawn, someone who kept to himself. They had no idea what thoughts churned behind those vacant eyes. No idea that their bunkmate was fighting a war inside his own mind, one he was slowly losing. The army discharged him in 1981 for his drinking problem. Suddenly, Jeffrey Dahmer was back in the real world, with no structure, no supervision, and no way to control what was building inside him. He moved back to Ohio, then to Milwaukee, drifting from job to job, apartment to apartment, always carrying that terrible secret from 1978. He worked at a blood bank. The irony wasn't lost on him, surrounded by vials of human blood, handling the very essence of life while fantasizing about death. He was fired for showing up drunk. Then he worked at a chocolate factory, the sweet smell of cocoa masking the darkness that consumed his thoughts. His grandmother Catherine took him in, worried about her grandson who seemed so lost, so troubled. But Catherine Hughes had no idea what she'd invited into her home. In her basement, Jeffrey would sit for hours, drinking beer, staring at the walls, replaying that night with Stephen Hicks over and over. The memory of power, of complete control, of finally acting on the fantasies that had haunted him since childhood. The thing about killers like Dahmer is that they're not driven by rage or revenge. They're driven by something much more disturbing, a need to possess, to control, to own another human being completely. And once you've tasted that kind of power, everything else feels empty. By 1987, the hunger had become unbearable. Jeffrey was frequenting gay bars in Milwaukee, not looking for companionship, but for opportunity. He'd sit in the shadows, nursing a drink, watching, waiting, selecting. He developed a routine, a method. He'd strike up conversations with men who seemed lonely, vulnerable, desperate. He'd offer them money, drinks, a place to stay. He'd promise them things they needed: companionship, shelter, drugs. September 15th, 1987, the Ambassador Hotel, room 507's Jeffrey Dahmer and Stephen Tuomi, a 25-year-old aspiring model, checked in together. What happened in that room remains a mystery, even to Dahmer himself. He claimed he woke up the next morning to find Tuomi dead, his chest crushed, blood everywhere. He said he had no memory of the killing, blamed it on a blackout from drinking. But here's the thing about Jeffrey Dahmer. He was a liar, a manipulator, a man who spent his entire life crafting stories to hide his true nature. The idea that he accidentally killed Stephen Tuomi, that he was horrified to wake up next to a corpse, it's almost certainly fiction. This wasn't an accident. This was the moment Jeffrey Dahmer stopped fighting his demons and embraced them. What he did next revealed the true depth of his depravity. He went out and bought a large suitcase. He dismembered Stephen Tuomi's body in that hotel room, packed the pieces into the suitcase, and calmly checked out. He even asked a taxi driver to help him load the suitcase into the car. When the driver commented on the terrible smell, Dahmer just shrugged, said it was old meat he was throwing away. Back at his grandmother's house, in the basement where he'd spent so many hours fantasizing, Jeffrey completed his ritual. He disposed of the flesh, but kept the bones. He cleaned them, bleached them, arranged them like trophies, just like he'd done with roadkill as a child, except now the bones were human. The pattern was set. The 9-year gap was over. Jeffrey Dahmer had found his true calling, and he was just getting started. Over the next few months, the killings accelerated. James Dockstader, a 14-year-old Native American boy, was lured to Dahmer's grandmother's house with promises of money for posing for photographs. Richard Guerrero, 22, disappeared after meeting Dahmer at a bar. Both were strangled, dismembered, their remains scattered or dissolved in acid. Dahmer was methodical and clinical. He'd developed a system for disposing of bodies that was both efficient and horrifying. He'd use chemicals to dissolve flesh, a process he'd learned from his high school chemistry classes. He'd keep skulls and bones as souvenirs, storing them in his room like macabre decorations. His grandmother began to notice strange smells coming from the basement. She'd find mysterious stains on Jeffrey's clothes, odd chemicals in the garage. But she loved her grandson, worried about his drinking, his isolation. She never imagined the truth was far worse than anything she could conceive. The killing spree continued. Anthony Sears, 26, was murdered in March 1989. Dahmer kept his skull, painted it gray to make it look like a plastic model. He told people it was for his art. Raymond Smith, 33, was killed in May 1990. Edward Smith, 28, disappeared in June. Ernest Miller, 22, was murdered in September. David Thomas, 23, was killed in September. Curtis Stroder, 18, vanished in February 1991. Each victim followed the same pattern. They were young men, mostly black or Hispanic, often from troubled backgrounds. They were vulnerable, desperate, easy to manipulate. Dahmer would meet them at gay bars, bus stations, shopping malls. He'd offer them money, alcohol, a place to stay. He'd promise them things they needed: work, companionship, drugs. Once he got them alone, the mask would come off. He'd drug their drinks with sleeping pills, then strangle them while they were unconscious. Sometimes he'd experiment with different methods, different chemicals, different ways of killing. He was like a scientist studying death, refining his technique with each murder. But Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just killing. He was living with the dead. He'd keep bodies in his apartment for days, sometimes weeks. He'd photograph them in various poses, arrange them like mannequins. He'd perform sexual acts on the corpses, fulfilling the necrophilic fantasies that had consumed him since adolescence. And then there was the cannibalism. Dahmer would cook and eat parts of his victims, claiming it made him feel closer to them, like they were becoming part of him. He'd store human flesh in his refrigerator, next to regular food. He'd grind up bones and scatter them in his garden. He'd keep skulls and organs as trophies, creating a museum of death in his small apartment. The most disturbing part wasn't just what he did to his victims after they died. It was what he planned to do to them while they were alive. Dahmer had developed an obsession with creating what he called zombies, living people who would be completely under his control. He'd drill holes in his victims' skulls and pour acid or boiling water into their brains, trying to create compliant, mindless companions. These experiments usually killed his victims quickly, but Dahmer kept trying, kept refining his technique. He wanted to create the perfect victim, alive but brain dead, capable of movement but incapable of independent thought. Someone who would never leave him, never reject him, never abandon him like everyone else in his life had done. The fantasy of absolute control had consumed him completely. He wasn't just killing people, he was trying to remake them in his image of the perfect companion. And with each failed experiment, with each death, he'd start the cycle over again. Find another victim, make another promise, commit another murder. By 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 15 people. His apartment at 924 North 25th Street had become a charnel house, filled with body parts, photographs of corpses, and the overwhelming stench of death. His neighbors complained about the smell, but Dahmer always had an explanation: spoiled meat, a broken freezer, a plumbing problem. He'd become careless, reckless. The gap between kills was shrinking. The risks he was taking were escalating. He was spiraling toward an inevitable confrontation with law enforcement, but he seemed almost to welcome it, like part of him wanted to be caught, wanted the nightmare to end. The Jeffrey Dahmer who'd killed Stephen Hicks in 1978 was an 18-year-old boy terrified of what he'd done. The Jeffrey Dahmer of 1991 was a 31-year-old man who'd turned murder into an art form, who'd created a factory of death in the heart of Milwaukee. The quiet and awkward teenager had become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and the worst part is he was just getting started. The discovery inside apartment 213 was beyond anything investigators had ever encountered. The stench hit them first, a nauseating cocktail of decay and chemicals that made seasoned officers gag. But what they found inside went far beyond their worst nightmares. Body parts were stored methodically throughout the apartment. Severed heads sat in the refrigerator like groceries. Human torsos were found in a large blue barrel, dissolving in acid. Photographs documenting every stage of mutilation and decay were scattered across surfaces like some twisted scrapbook. But perhaps most disturbing was the methodical nature of it all. This wasn't chaotic violence. This was systematic, calculated preservation. Dahmer had turned his apartment into a laboratory of death where human beings were reduced to specimens and trophies. Skulls were cleaned and painted, skeletons were bleached and prepared for display. Hearts and other organs were stored in the freezer for later consumption. The investigation revealed the full scope of Dahmer's depravity. He had been drilling holes into victims' skulls while they were still alive, pouring acid and boiling water into their brains in twisted attempts to create compliant zombies. He wanted complete control, even over death itself. The victims weren't just murdered, they were transformed into objects for his perverse fantasies. When Tracy Edwards led police back to that apartment, he had no idea he was about to expose one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. The man who had seemed so normal, so polite, so harmless, had been living among the dead for years. His neighbors had complained about strange smells, but nobody imagined the reality of what was happening just feet away from their own homes. The immediate aftermath was chaos. News crews descended on the scene like vultures. The apartment building was evacuated as investigators worked to catalog the evidence. Body bags were carried out one after another, each one representing a life stolen, a family destroyed, a future erased. The scale of the horror was almost incomprehensible. What made it worse was realizing how close Dahmer had come to being caught multiple times. The Konarak synthesomphone incident wasn't an isolated failure. There had been other close calls, other moments when the system could have intervened. Neighbors had called police about the smells. Victims had nearly escaped before, but somehow Dahmer had always managed to slip through the cracks. The victims' families were devastated. Many had been searching for their missing loved ones for months, even years. Some had filed missing person reports that were never properly investigated. Others had been told their sons or brothers had probably just moved on, started new lives elsewhere. The reality was far more brutal. As the investigation continued, the true extent of Dahmer's crimes became clear. He had been killing for over a decade, perfecting his methods, becoming more brazen with each murder. The apartment was just the final chapter in a long story of violence and depravity that had begun with Stephen Hicks in 1978. The community was shattered. How could something like this happen in their neighborhood? How could someone so evil hide in plain sight for so long? The questions haunted everyone who lived in the area, everyone who had ever encountered Dahmer, everyone who realized how close they had come to encountering a monster. But the horror wasn't over. As police dug deeper into Dahmer's background, they discovered the full timeline of his crimes, the gap between his first and second murders, the escalation after his grandmother's house, the increasing frequency of the killings in his apartment. Each revelation was another punch to the gut for a community already reeling from the initial discovery. The media circus was relentless. Reporters camped outside the apartment building, interviewing anyone who would talk. The story dominated headlines across the country. Everyone wanted to understand how someone could do such things, how the system had failed so completely, how evil could flourish unchecked for so long. Inside the apartment, investigators continued their grim work. Every surface had to be examined, every container had to be opened, every photograph had to be cataloged. The crime scene technicians had never encountered anything like it. Some requested transfers, others required counseling. The psychological toll on everyone involved was enormous. The smell lingered for months. Even after the apartment was cleaned, even after the building was eventually torn down, people in the neighborhood swore they could still smell death in the air. The trauma wasn't just emotional, it was physical, embedded in the very environment where Dahmer had carried out his crimes. As the full inventory of evidence was compiled, the statistics were staggering. 11 complete victims found in the apartment, hundreds of photographs documenting torture and murder, body parts from at least 7 different people, chemical supplies for dissolving flesh, tools for dismemberment, a complete infrastructure for killing and disposal. The confession began almost immediately. Dahmer didn't try to deny what had happened. He couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming. But more than that, he seemed almost relieved to finally be caught. The burden of his secrets, the constant fear of discovery, the escalating compulsions, it had all become too much to bear. Detective Patrick Kennedy would spend the next 2 weeks interviewing Dahmer, compiling a confession that would run to 178 pages. Hour after hour, Dahmer would describe his crimes in clinical detail, the methods he used, the feelings he experienced, the motivations that drove him to kill again and again. It was a window into a mind so twisted that even experienced investigators struggled to comprehend it. The confession revealed patterns that investigators had missed. Dahmer's victim selection wasn't random. He specifically targeted vulnerable young men, often from marginalized communities. He knew these victims were less likely to be missed quickly, giving him time to carry out his rituals without detection. It was predatory behavior taken to its most extreme conclusion. But perhaps the most chilling was Dahmer's matter-of-fact tone throughout the confession. He described horrific acts of violence and depravity as if he were discussing the weather. There was no emotion, no remorse, no recognition of the humanity of his victims. They were objects to him, nothing more. The trial would come later, but the investigation had already revealed everything the public needed to know. Jeffrey Dahmer was a monster who had hidden among us for over a decade. He had killed 17 people, destroyed countless families, and traumatized an entire community. The apartment on North 25th Street had been a chamber of horrors, and its discovery marked the end of one of the most shocking criminal cases in American history. By the summer of 1991, the walls were closing in on Jeffrey Dahmer. But what's truly chilling is how close he came to being caught years earlier. The signs were there, the smell seeping from his apartment that neighbors complained about for months, the strange sounds at night, the constant stream of young men who entered his building but were never seen leaving. Yet somehow, this monster continued to operate in plain sight, perfecting his methods and feeding his insatiable hunger for control and death. The breakthrough came on a hot July night when Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man from Mississippi, made a decision that would save his life and expose one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. Edwards had been wandering the streets of Milwaukee when Dahmer approached him near the Grand Avenue Mall. Like so many before him, Edwards was lured by Dahmer's calm demeanor and promises of money for nude photographs. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was Edwards' street smarts, or maybe it was pure instinct, but he remained alert, even as Dahmer led him back to the Oxford apartments. Inside apartment 213, the nightmare began as it always did. Dahmer offered Edwards a drink, but Edwards was careful, pretending to sip while avoiding actually consuming the drugged beer. As the evening progressed, Dahmer's mask began to slip. His friendly demeanor turned cold and predatory. He snapped a handcuff onto Edwards' wrist and held a large butcher knife to his chest. The smell in the apartment was overwhelming, a sickly, sweet stench of death and chemicals that made Edwards gag. Dahmer's eyes took on that familiar vacant stare as he leaned in close and whispered the words that would haunt Edwards forever. "I'm going to eat your heart." What happened next was pure survival instinct. Edwards knew he was moments away from becoming another victim in Dahmer's twisted collection. When Dahmer momentarily relaxed his guard, Edwards struck. He punched Dahmer in the face with his free hand, sending the killer stumbling backward. In that split second, Edwards bolted for the door, running for his life with the handcuffs still dangling from his wrist. He ran through the hallway, down the stairs, and out onto the street, screaming for help. At 11:30 p.m. on July 22, 1991, Milwaukee police officers Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller were patrolling the area when they spotted Edwards running down North 25th Street. He was shirtless, panicked, and had a handcuff hanging from his left wrist. The officers initially thought they were dealing with a domestic dispute, but Edwards' story was so bizarre and terrifying that they decided to investigate. He told them about the man who had tried to kill him, about the awful smell in the apartment, and about the photographs he had seen scattered around the room. The officers accompanied Edwards back to the Oxford apartments, expecting to find perhaps a simple assault case or maybe a drug-related incident. They had no idea they were about to walk into a scene that would redefine their understanding of human evil. When they knocked on the door of apartment 213, Jeffrey Dahmer answered. He was calm, polite, and seemingly cooperative. He explained that he and Edwards had simply had a lover's quarrel, that Edwards was his boyfriend, and that everything was fine now. But Officer Mueller noticed something that made his blood run cold. On a table in the living room, he could see Polaroid photographs scattered about. As he moved closer to examine them, the images became clear. They were pictures of human bodies in various states of dismemberment. Some showed corpses posed in grotesque positions. Others captured the step-by-step process of dismemberment. The photographs were meticulous, clinical, like documentation of a twisted scientific experiment. The moment Dahmer realized the officers had seen the photographs, his demeanor changed completely. The mask of normalcy fell away, revealing the monster beneath. He lunged toward the bedroom, probably trying to reach a weapon, but the officers were faster. They tackled him to the ground and placed him under arrest. As they handcuffed him, Dahmer's only words were a soft, almost relieved whisper. "For what I did, I should be dead." What the officers discovered next would traumatize them for the rest of their lives. The apartment was a charnel house, a laboratory of death where Dahmer had been conducting his horrific experiments for years. In the refrigerator, they found a severed head wrapped in plastic. The freezer contained packages of human flesh, neatly labeled and stored like cuts of meat. A 57-gallon drum in the bedroom held decomposing torsos dissolved in acid, Skulls were lined up on shelves like trophies. A heart was found in the freezer, waiting to be consumed. The smell was indescribable. It was the stench of death, of chemicals, of decay that had been building for months. Officers had to step outside repeatedly to vomit. The Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's office was called in, along with the FBI. What they found was evidence of at least 11 murders, all committed in this single apartment. Body parts were scattered throughout the rooms. Some victims had been completely dismembered, their remains dissolved in acid or stored in containers. Others had been partially consumed, their flesh prepared and cooked in Dahmer's kitchen. The investigation revealed the true scope of Dahmer's depravity. He had been living with decomposing bodies for months, sleeping in the same room where he stored his victims' remains. He had been eating parts of his victims, claiming it made him feel closer to them, that it gave him a sense of permanent possession. The photographs showed not just the aftermath of murder, but the process itself. Dahmer had documented his crimes with the detachment of a scientist, creating a visual record of his descent into complete madness. Detective Patrick Kennedy was assigned to interrogate Dahmer, and what followed was one of the most disturbing confessions in criminal history. Over the course of several interviews, totaling more than 60 hours, Dahmer laid out the full extent of his crimes. He confessed to 17 murders spanning 13 years, describing each killing in methodical detail. He spoke about his victims as if they were objects, describing their physical attributes and explaining his selection process with chilling precision. Dahmer explained his methods with the calm detachment of someone discussing a hobby. He would meet potential victims in gay bars, shopping malls, or bus stops, targeting young men who appeared vulnerable or desperate. He would offer them money to pose for photographs or simply invite them back to his apartment for drinks. Once there, he would drug their beer with sleeping pills, then strangle them while they were unconscious. What happened next was always the same: dismemberment, preservation, and often consumption. The confession revealed that Dahmer's crimes had evolved over time, becoming more elaborate and more disturbing. In his later murders, he had begun experimenting with ways to create what he called zombies, living victims who would be completely submissive to his will. He would drill holes in their skulls and inject muriatic acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to create a permanent state of compliance. These experiments always resulted in death, but Dahmer continued trying, convinced he could perfect the process. Perhaps most disturbing was Dahmer's explanation of his motivation. He claimed he killed not out of hatred, but out of loneliness, and a desperate need for companionship. He wanted to possess his victims completely, to ensure they could never leave him. By killing them, dismembering them, and consuming their flesh, he believed he could make them a permanent part of himself. It was a twisted form of love, a desire for connection so warped that it could only be satisfied through murder and cannibalism. The victims' identities began to emerge as the investigation continued. They were young men, mostly African American, Hispanic, or Asian, ranging in age from 14 to 33. Many were from marginalized communities, men who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. Stephen Hicks, the 18-year-old hitchhiker, had been Dahmer's first victim in 1978. Stephen Tuomi, killed in 1987, had marked the beginning of Dahmer's most prolific period. There was James Dockstader, only 14 years old when he was murdered. Richard Guerrero, 25, who had been lured from a gay bar, Anthony Sears, whose skull Dahmer had kept as a trophy. Each name represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, a community traumatized. The victims had been sons, brothers, friends. They had dreams, aspirations, people who loved them. Dahmer had reduced them to objects, to pieces of flesh to be consumed, to bones to be preserved. The randomness of their selection made their deaths even more tragic. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with a predator who saw them not as human beings, but as potential possessions. The discovery of Dahmer's crimes sent shockwaves through Milwaukee and the nation. The city's African American community was particularly devastated, as so many of the victims had come from their neighborhoods. Questions were raised about why the disappearances hadn't been investigated more thoroughly, why the complaints about smells and strange noises had been ignored. The case exposed deep-seated issues about how society values certain lives over others, about whose disappearances matter and whose don't. The Konarak synthesophone case became a particular source of outrages and grief. The 14-year-old boy had actually escaped from Dahmer's apartment in May 1991, naked and bleeding, speaking frantically in Laotian to anyone who would listen. 3 African American women had tried to help him, calling police and insisting something was wrong. But when officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had simply had a lover's quarrel. Despite the women's protests, despite the boy's obvious distress, police returned Konarak to Dahmer's apartment. Within an hour, the boy was dead. The failure to save Konarak highlighted systemic problems in how police responded to incidents involving minorities and the LGBTQ community. If officers had simply checked Dahmer's background, they would have discovered his conviction for child molestation. If they had listened to the women trying to help Konarak, they might have prevented not only his death, but the deaths of 4 other men who would die in the following months. The case became a symbol of institutional failure, of how prejudice and assumption can have deadly consequences. As news of the crimes spread, the media descended on Milwaukee like vultures. The story had all the elements that capture public attention: a seemingly ordinary man living a double life, crimes so horrific they seemed beyond human comprehension, victims from communities that mainstream America often ignored. The coverage was intense and often sensationalized, turning Dahmer into a household name and his victims into footnotes in a larger narrative about evil and depravity. The apartment building where Dahmer had committed his crimes became a macabre tourist attraction. People would drive by slowly, taking pictures, trying to catch a glimpse of the windows where such horror had occurred. The other residents, traumatized by the discovery of what had been happening just down the hall, found themselves prisoners in their own homes, unable to escape the constant reminder of the evil that had lived among them. The psychological impact on the community was profound and lasting. Parents held their children closer, young men altered their routines, and an entire city grappled with the knowledge that such evil could exist in their midst. The randomness of Dahmer's selection criteria meant that anyone could have been a victim. There was no way to protect yourself from someone who chose his targets based on nothing more than opportunity and convenience. Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest marked the end of one of the most horrific killing sprees in American history, but it was also the beginning of a long and painful process of understanding how such evil could exist and persist for so long. The man who had seemed so ordinary, so forgettable, had been living a double life that defied comprehension. By day, he was a quiet factory worker who kept to himself. By night, he was a predator who stalked the streets of Milwaukee, hunting for victims to feed his insatiable hunger for death and control. The case would raise questions that society is still grappling with today. How do we identify and stop such predators before they can claim multiple victims? How do we protect the most vulnerable members of our communities? How do we ensure that disappearances are investigated thoroughly, regardless of the victim's race, sexuality, or social status? Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes were a mirror held up to society, reflecting back not just the capacity for individual evil, but the systemic failures that allow such evil to flourish. The investigation into Jeffrey Dahmer's horrific crimes revealed a chilling pattern of methodical brutality that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. When police finally gained access to apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street, they discovered what can only be described as a chamber of horrors that defied human comprehension. The scene that greeted investigators was beyond anything they had encountered in their careers. The refrigerator contained severed heads, carefully preserved as if they were ordinary groceries. The freezer held additional body parts, wrapped and stored with disturbing precision. Throughout the apartment, investigators found evidence of Dahmer's twisted rituals, photographs documenting his victims in various stages of decomposition, chemical solutions used for preserving flesh, and tools that revealed the methodical nature of his crimes. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the organized nature of everything. This wasn't the chaotic scene of a frenzied killer. Instead, investigators found a carefully maintained laboratory of death where Dahmer had been conducting his grotesque experiments for years. The apartment contained multiple skulls, some painted, others bleached white, arranged like trophies. Body parts were found in acid-filled containers, slowly dissolving as part of Dahmer's disposal process. The smell that permeated the building had been noticed by neighbors for months, but complaints to the landlord were dismissed as problems with the plumbing or garbage disposal. Residents had grown accustomed to the stench, never imagining that it emanated from the decomposing remains of 17 human beings. The very ordinariness of the building, the normalcy of daily life continuing around such horror, added another layer of disturbing reality to the case. As investigators worked through the night, cataloging evidence and trying to piece together the timeline of Dahmer's crimes, they began to understand the full scope of what had been happening in Milwaukee. This wasn't just a series of murders, it was a sustained campaign of violence against the most vulnerable members of society, carried out by a man who had perfected his methods over more than a decade. The medical examiner's office faced an unprecedented challenge in processing the remains. Many victims could only be identified through dental records or distinctive jewelry. Some had been so thoroughly dismembered and dissolved that identification became impossible. The forensic team worked around the clock, but the magnitude of the scene meant that the investigation would take weeks to complete. What emerged from the physical evidence painted a picture of systematic torture and murder. Dahmer had developed a routine, a method that he refined with each victim. He would lure them to his apartment, drug them, and then begin his horrific rituals. The evidence showed that he had been experimenting with different chemicals, different methods of preservation, constantly evolving his techniques. The discovery of the drilling equipment was particularly chilling. Investigators found evidence that Dahmer had been attempting to create what he called zombies by drilling holes into his victims' skulls and injecting various substances directly into their brains. He wanted to create compliant, living victims who would never leave him. The primitive lobotomy attempts were carried out on conscious victims, adding another dimension of horror to crimes that already defied comprehension. Among the most disturbing evidence were the detailed photographs Dahmer had taken throughout his killing process. These images documented not just the final results of his crimes, but the step-by-step process of dismemberment and disposal. The photographs revealed a man who took pride in his work, who wanted to preserve every moment of his victims' degradation and death. The investigation also uncovered Dahmer's makeshift altar, constructed from the remains of his victims. Skulls were arranged in a specific pattern, candles were placed at precise intervals, and the entire setup suggested some form of ritualistic worship. When questioned about this, Dahmer claimed he was trying to create a space where he could commune with his victims, where their spirits would remain with him forever. As news of the discoveries spread throughout Milwaukee, the community struggled to process the magnitude of what had been happening in their midst. The Oxford Apartments became a focal point for both curiosity and revulsion. People gathered outside the building, some drawn by morbid fascination, others coming to pay respects to the victims who had died in such terrible circumstances. The impact on the families of the victims was devastating. Many had been searching for their missing loved ones for years, holding on to hope that they were still alive somewhere. The confirmation that their sons, brothers, and fathers had met such horrific ends was almost too much to bear. Some families had never even reported their loved ones missing, assuming they had simply moved on or were living on the streets. The investigation revealed systematic failures at multiple levels of law enforcement and social services. Records showed that several victims had been reported missing, but the cases had not been prioritized or thoroughly investigated. The marginalized status of many victims meant that their disappearances were often treated as routine rather than suspicious. The psychological profile that emerged from the evidence painted a picture of a man who had completely disconnected from human empathy. Dahmer's crimes weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated acts of violence carried out by someone who had developed an elaborate fantasy world where other human beings existed solely for his gratification. What made Dahmer particularly dangerous was his ability to appear normal, even charming to those around him. Neighbors described him as quiet and polite. Co-workers found him reliable and hardworking. This facade allowed him to continue his crimes for years without arousing suspicion. The contrast between his public persona and his private reality was so stark that even those closest to him struggled to reconcile the Jeffrey Dahmer they knew with the monster whose crimes were being revealed. The evidence also showed that Dahmer's crimes had been escalating in both frequency and brutality. The gap between his first murder in 1978 and his second in 1987 had given way to an increasingly rapid succession of killings. By 1991, he was killing almost monthly, suggesting that his compulsions were becoming stronger and more difficult to control. The investigation into Dahmer's crimes would eventually lead to broader questions about society's treatment of marginalized communities, the effectiveness of law enforcement, and the warning signs that had been missed or ignored. The case became a turning point in how serial crimes were investigated and prosecuted, leading to changes in police procedures and victim advocacy programs. As investigators continued their grim work, processing evidence and trying to identify remains, the full scope of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes began to emerge. What they found in apartment 213 was more than just physical evidence of murder. It was a window into a mind so twisted and depraved that it challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the capacity for evil. The methodical nature of Dahmer's crimes, the elaborate rituals he had developed, and the casual way he had been living among the remains of his victims revealed a level of psychological dysfunction that defied easy explanation. This wasn't simply a case of mental illness or temporary insanity. It was the systematic destruction of human life carried out by someone who had made a conscious choice to embrace his darkest impulses. The discovery of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes marked the end of his killing spree, but it was just the beginning of a long and difficult process of understanding what had happened and why. The evidence found in apartment 213 would fuel decades of research into the psychology of serial killers and the societal factors that allow such crimes to continue undetected. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began in January 1992, and it would become one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers, all trying to understand how a man could commit such unspeakable acts. But what made this case truly extraordinary wasn't just the gruesome nature of the crimes. It was Dahmer's decision to change his plea from not guilty to guilty but insane. This wasn't a typical criminal trial. By pleading guilty, Dahmer had already admitted to the murders. The question before the jury wasn't whether he committed these acts, but whether he was legally sane when he did them. The defense argued that only someone completely detached from reality could engage in such horrific behavior. How could a sane person drill holes into living victims' skulls and pour acid into their brains? How could a rational mind justify eating human flesh or keeping severed heads as trophies? The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture. They argued that Dahmer's actions were calculated, methodical, and deliberate. He knew exactly what he was doing at every step. He bought the chemicals to dissolve bodies, he purchased the tools to dismember them, and he carefully planned each murder to avoid detection. This wasn't the work of a madman, they claimed, but of a cold-blooded killer who simply chose evil. The defense brought in psychiatrists who testified about Dahmer's severe mental illness. They diagnosed him with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder. Dr. Frederick Fosdahl testified that Dahmer was driven by an irresistible impulse to kill, and that his necrophilia was evidence of his complete break from reality. According to the defense, Dahmer's crimes were so bizarre and extreme that they could only be explained by severe mental illness. But the prosecution's psychiatrists told a different story. Dr. Park Dietz, a renowned forensic psychiatrist, testified that while Dahmer was certainly disturbed, he was not legally insane. Dietz argued that Dahmer knew his actions were wrong evidenced by his attempts to hide his crimes, his careful disposal of bodies, and his ability to appear normal to neighbors and coworkers. The fact that he could hold down a job, maintain relationships, and function in society proved that he understood the difference between right and wrong. The jury heard testimony about Dahmer's childhood, his troubled relationship with his parents, and his early signs of mental disturbance. They learned about his fascination with dead animals, his social isolation, and his growing fantasies of violence. But they also heard about his methodical approach to murder, his careful planning, and his ability to deceive those around him. One of the most chilling aspects of the trial was Dahmer's own testimony. So he spoke in a calm, monotone voice, describing his crimes with disturbing detachment. He explained how he would meet his victims, how he would lure them to his apartment, and how he would kill them. There was no emotion, no remorse, just a clinical recounting of horrific acts. He described his cannibalism matter-of-factly, explaining that he ate parts of his victims because he wanted them to become part of him permanently. The families of the victims sat in the courtroom, listening to these gruesome details about their loved ones' final moments. Some wept openly, others stared in stunned silence. Rita Isbell, the sister of victim Errol Lindsay, delivered a powerful victim impact statement, confronting Dahmer directly about the pain he had caused. Her raw emotion and anger provided a stark contrast to Dahmer's cold demeanor. The trial lasted just 2 weeks, but the jury deliberated for over 10 hours. They had to decide whether Dahmer was a monster who chose evil or a severely mentally ill man who couldn't control his actions. The legal standard for insanity in Wisconsin was strict, requiring that the defendant either didn't know what he was doing or didn't know that what he was doing was wrong. On February 15th, 1992, the jury returned their verdict. They found Jeffrey Dahmer guilty, but sane on all counts. The decision was unanimous. The jury foreman later explained that while they believed Dahmer was mentally ill, they also believed he knew his actions were wrong and chose to commit them anyway. His ability to function in society, hold jobs, and conceal his crimes demonstrated that he understood the consequences of his actions. Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be eligible for parole. In Wisconsin, there was no death penalty, so life imprisonment was the harshest punishment available. The judge also sentenced him to an additional life term for the murder of Stephen Hicks in Ohio, bringing his total sentence to 16 life terms. At his sentencing, Dahmer was given the opportunity to address the court. What he said would be remembered as one of the most haunting statements ever delivered in a courtroom. He spoke quietly, reading from a prepared statement, expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse for his actions. He said he wished he could bring back the victims, that he deserved whatever punishment he received, and that he finally understood the sickness that had driven him to commit these crimes. But perhaps most disturbing was his final statement. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. These words suggested that Dahmer had finally gained some insight into his condition, but they came too late for his 17 victims. The trial raised profound questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and personal responsibility. Could someone be so mentally ill that they couldn't be held responsible for their actions, even when those actions were as horrific as Dahmer's? The jury's verdict suggested that mental illness, no matter how severe, didn't excuse such calculated and prolonged criminal behavior. After sentencing, Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. For the first year, he was kept in solitary confinement for his own protection. Prison officials knew that child killers and cannibals were often targeted by other inmates, and Dahmer's crimes had made him one of the most hated men in America. During his time in solitary, Dahmer received thousands of letters from around the world. Some were from people expressing hatred and disgust, others from individuals fascinated by his crimes, and still others from people claiming to understand his pain. He spent his days reading, writing letters, and reportedly studying religious texts. Prison officials noted that he seemed to be a model prisoner, quiet and compliant. After a year in isolation, Dahmer requested to be moved to the general population. He said he wanted to work and interact with other inmates. Against the advice of many, prison officials granted his request, assigning him to work detail cleaning bathrooms and the prison gymnasium. This decision would prove to be fatal. In prison, Dahmer reportedly found religion, claiming to have become a born-again Christian. He was baptized in May 1994, and prison chaplains said he seemed genuinely remorseful for his crimes. He participated in Bible study groups and spoke about wanting to help other inmates find peace. Some questioned whether this religious conversion was genuine or simply another manipulation by a man who had spent his life deceiving others. The families of Dahmer's victims had mixed reactions to his apparent transformation. Some found comfort in the possibility that he had found genuine remorse, while others remained skeptical. Many simply wanted him to disappear from public consciousness, tired of seeing his name in headlines and his face on television screens. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to work detail as usual. He was cleaning the prison gymnasium alongside two other inmates, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. Scarver, who was serving a life sentence for murder, had a history of mental illness and had expressed hatred for Dahmer and Anderson, who was also a convicted killer. The three men were left unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes. During that time, Scarver attacked both Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer was beaten so severely that his skull was crushed. He was rushed to the hospital but died from his injuries an hour later. He was 34 years old. The attack appeared to be premeditated. Scarver later claimed that he had been disgusted by Dahmer's crimes and had planned to kill him. He said that Dahmer had been taunting other inmates by shaping his food into body parts and using ketchup to simulate blood. Whether this was true or simply Scarver's justification for murder remains unclear. The news of Dahmer's death spread quickly. Some celebrated, feeling that justice had finally been served. Others worried about the precedent of allowing vigilante justice in prison. The families of Dahmer's victims again had mixed reactions. Some felt relieved that they would no longer have to worry about him potentially being released or continuing to generate media attention. Others felt that his death robbed them of the opportunity to confront him further or to understand why he had taken their loved ones. Jeffrey Dahmer's death marked the end of one of the most horrific chapters in American criminal history, but his legacy lived on in the questions his case raised about mental illness, criminal justice and the nature of evil itself. His crimes had exposed systemic failures in law enforcement, social services, and society's treatment of marginalized communities. The case also highlighted the need for better training for police officers, particularly in dealing with domestic disputes and situations involving minorities. The incident with Conorak Synthosamphone had shown how prejudice and assumptions could literally be a matter of life and death. The officers who returned the bleeding, drugged teenager to Dahmer were never criminally charged, though they were eventually fired from the force. Mental health professionals continue to study Dahmer's case, trying to understand how someone could commit such acts and whether there were warning signs that might have prevented his crimes. His childhood fascination with death and violence, his social isolation, and his early alcohol abuse were all red flags that went unaddressed. The case underscored the importance of early intervention and mental health support for troubled youth. The Milwaukee community struggled to heal from the trauma of Dahmer's crimes. The apartment building where he lived was eventually demolished, and the site remains empty to this day. The city implemented new programs to support marginalized communities and improve police relations with minority groups. But the scars of Dahmer's crimes remained, a reminder of how one man's evil could devastate an entire community. In the years since his death, Jeffrey Dahmer has become a figure of enduring fascination and horror. Countless books, documentaries, and films have been made about his life and crimes. Some critics argue that this continued attention glorifies his actions and causes additional pain to the families of his victims. Others contend that studying cases like Dahmer's is important for understanding criminal behavior and preventing future tragedies. The victims of Jeffrey Dahmer deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a horrific crime spree, but as individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and loved ones. Stephen Hicks was just 18 when he was murdered, looking forward to a rock concert and a bright future. Conorak Synthosamphone was only 14, a child who should have been protected by the very system that failed him. Each of Dahmer's 17 victims had their own story, their own potential, cut short by his twisted desires. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most studied and discussed in criminal history. It serves as a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity and the importance of recognizing and addressing the warning signs of dangerous behavior. It also highlights the need for a society that protects its most vulnerable members and ensures that justice is truly blind to race, class, and sexual orientation. The horror didn't end with Dahmer's conviction. In many ways, it was just beginning. The man who had terrorized Milwaukee for over a decade was about to face a different kind of judgment, one that would come not from a court of law, but from the very system that was meant to contain him. Following his sentencing in February 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. For the first year of his incarceration, he was placed in protective custody, isolated from the general population. Prison officials knew what they were dealing with. The nature of his crimes, the media coverage, the sheer revulsion his name evoked, it all made him a target. But Dahmer himself seemed almost indifferent to the danger. He read, he wrote letters, he maintained correspondence with people from around the world who were inexplicably drawn to his story. What's particularly chilling is how normal he appeared during this time. Guards described him as polite, quiet, almost unremarkable. He followed the rules, caused no trouble, and seemed to settle into prison life with an ease that disturbed many who observed him. This wasn't the behavior of a man racked with guilt or consumed by remorse. This was a man who had simply accepted his new reality. After serving his first year in solitary confinement, Dahmer made a request that would ultimately seal his fate. He asked to be transferred to the general population. Prison officials were hesitant, but Dahmer insisted. He claimed he was no longer suicidal and wanted to participate in work programs. Against their better judgment, they granted his request. It was a decision that would haunt them. Dahmer was assigned to a work detail in the prison gym, cleaning bathrooms and equipment alongside other inmates. For a brief period, this arrangement seemed to work. He kept to himself, performed his duties without complaint, and avoided confrontation. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Other inmates knew who he was, what he had done, and many of them came from the very communities he had terrorized. The racial dynamics of his crimes hadn't been forgotten. Dahmer had specifically targeted young men of color, exploiting their vulnerability and society's indifference to their disappearances. Now, surrounded by men who saw him as a symbol of that exploitation, he was living on borrowed time. Some inmates made their feelings known through verbal confrontations, others through more subtle forms of intimidation. Dahmer, for his part, seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around him. During this period, something unexpected happened. Dahmer claimed to have found religion. He began attending chapel services, reading religious texts, and even underwent baptism in May 1994. To some, this represented a genuine spiritual awakening, a last grasp at redemption. To others, it was merely another manipulation, another mask worn by a man who had spent his life deceiving those around him. The truth, as with so much of Dahmer's story, remains elusive. His family received mixed reactions to this supposed conversion. His father, Lionel, wanted to believe his son had found peace. His stepmother was more skeptical. The families of his victims were split between those who saw it as a positive development and those who viewed it as an insult to their loved one's memory. For them, no amount of religious conversion could undo the horror he had inflicted. But faith, genuine or otherwise, wouldn't save Jeffrey Dahmer from the violence that had defined his life. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to his usual work detail in the prison gym. He was accompanied by two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Anderson was serving time for the murder of his wife, while Scarver was imprisoned for a fatal shooting during a robbery. The three men were left unsupervised for a brief period, a violation of standard protocol that would prove fatal. What happened next lasted only minutes, but ended a story that had captivated and horrified the nation for years. Christopher Scarver, who had been dealing with his own psychological issues and harbored deep resentment toward both Dahmer and Anderson, attacked them with a metal bar from the prison weight room. The assault was swift and brutal. Dahmer was struck repeatedly in the head, suffering massive trauma that left him unconscious. Anderson was also attacked, but survived the initial assault, though he would die from his injuries shortly after. Dahmer was rushed to a nearby hospital, but the damage was too severe. He died from his injuries approximately 1 hour after the attack, never regaining consciousness. He was 34 years old. The man who had taken 17 lives had met his end in a manner that mirrored the violence he had inflicted on others. The reaction to Dahmer's death was as complex as the man himself. Some viewed it as poetic justice, a fitting end for someone who had caused so much suffering. Others saw it as a tragedy, the loss of a human being who, despite his crimes, deserved to live out his sentence under the protection of the state. The families of his victims were similarly divided. Some expressed relief that he could no longer hurt anyone, while others had hoped he would live long enough to provide more information about their loved ones' final moments. Prison officials faced intense scrutiny over the circumstances of Dahmer's death. How had 3 inmates been left unsupervised? Why wasn't Dahmer in protective custody? The investigation revealed a series of failures in the prison system, from inadequate staffing to poor communication between guards. 2 prison employees were ultimately fired, and the incident led to significant changes in how high-profile inmates were managed. Christopher Scarver, Dahmer's killer, would later claim that he had been disgusted by Dahmer's crimes and his behavior in prison. He alleged that Dahmer would fashion his food into body parts and use ketchup to simulate blood, taunting other inmates with reminders of his cannibalistic acts. Whether these claims were true or simply an attempt to justify his actions remains uncertain, but they added another layer of disturbing detail to an already horrific story. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer marked the end of a chapter, but not the end of the story. The questions his case raised about mental health, criminal justice, and societal responsibility continue to resonate today. How does someone become capable of such extreme violence? What warning signs were missed? How do we prevent future tragedies while ensuring justice for those who have already suffered? In the years following his death, Dahmer's case has been studied extensively by criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists. His brain was examined for abnormalities, his childhood was dissected for clues, and his methods were analyzed for patterns. Yet despite all this scrutiny, Jeffrey Dahmer remains in many ways as enigmatic in death as he was in life. The complete picture of what drove him to commit such heinous acts may never be fully understood. What we do know is that his story serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within humanity. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the society we live in, the systems we trust to protect us, and the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a monster from a fairy tale or a villain from a horror movie. He was a real person who lived among us, worked alongside us, and fooled us all. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is one of horror, but also of hard-won knowledge. His case has led to improvements in police procedures, changes in how missing persons cases are handled, and a greater awareness of the signs of dangerous behavior. The lives he took were not lost in vain if their stories can help prevent future tragedies. As we reflect on the life and death of Jeffrey Dahmer, we must remember that behind every statistic, every case study, every sensational headline, there were real people. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Tuomi, Jamie Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Stroder, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Konarak Synthesymphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. These were not just victims. They were sons, brothers, friends, and loved ones whose lives were cut short by one man's incomprehensible evil. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's story is not just about one man's descent into darkness, it's about all of us and our responsibility to each other. It's about the importance of listening to those who are crying out for help, of not turning away from the uncomfortable realities of mental illness and violence, and of building a society where such horrors become impossible. The Milwaukee cannibal may be gone, but the lessons his terrible legacy teaches us must never be forgotten. Jeffrey Dahmer was serving 15 consecutive life sentences at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. For the first year of his incarceration, he was held in protective custody, isolated from the general population. Prison officials weren't taking any chances. They knew what would happen if word got out about what he'd done. They knew the kind of justice that waited for him in the general population. But Dahmer wasn't content to hide forever. After that first year, he requested to be moved to general population. He wanted to work. He wanted to interact with other inmates. Maybe he thought enough time had passed. Maybe he believed his newfound Christian faith would protect him. Or maybe deep down, he knew exactly what he was walking into. The prison administration eventually agreed to his request. They moved him to a less secure unit, where he was assigned to a work detail cleaning the prison gymnasium and bathroom facilities. It was mundane work, but it gave him something to do. More importantly, it put him in direct contact with other inmates for hours at a time. Prison is a different world with different rules. There's a hierarchy that exists beyond the reach of guards and administrators. At the bottom of that hierarchy are the child killers, the rapists, and the cannibals. Whoa. Jeffrey Dahmer was all three. Word travels fast in prison, and everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what he'd done. But Dahmer seemed almost oblivious to the danger. He went about his daily routine with the same methodical precision he'd applied to everything else in his life. He woke up at the same time every day. He ate his meals quietly. He performed his work duties without complaint. He even attended religious services, claiming to have found God behind bars. Other inmates watched him with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. Here was the man who had terrorized Milwaukee, who had turned his apartment into a house of horrors, who had eaten human flesh and drilled holes in living victims' skulls, and now he was mopping floors and cleaning toilets like any other prisoner. Some inmates tried to avoid him entirely. Others made their feelings known through hostile stares and muttered threats. But Dahmer continued his routine, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about the growing tension around him. He told his father in letters that he was adjusting well to prison life, that he was finding peace through his faith. The reality was far different. Prison records show that Dahmer received numerous threats during his time in general population. Guards found notes slipped under his cell door promising violence. Other inmates would spit in his food or knock into him in the hallways. The pressure was building, and everyone could feel it. Christopher Scarver was serving a life sentence for murder when he encountered Jeffrey Dahmer. Scarver was a troubled man with a history of mental illness and violent outbursts. He had killed a Wisconsin Conservation Corps worker in 1990 during a botched robbery, claiming that Jesus Christ had told him to do it. Like Dahmer, Scarver had his own demons, his own twisted relationship with reality. But unlike Dahmer, Scarver commanded respect among the other inmates. He was seen as unpredictable, dangerous, someone you didn't want to cross. When he spoke, people listened. When he was angry, people got out of his way. And Christopher Scarver was very angry about sharing space with Jeffrey Dahmer. Scarver later claimed that Dahmer would taunt other inmates by shaping his prison food into body parts and using ketchup as fake blood. He said Dahmer would leave these grotesque displays around the prison as a sick joke, a way of reminding everyone what he was capable of. Whether these claims were true or fabricated to justify what happened next, they painted a picture of a man who hadn't learned to keep his head down, who couldn't resist poking at the hatred surrounding him. On the morning of November 28th, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work detail in the prison gymnasium, along with two other inmates, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. Anderson was serving a life sentence for murdering his wife and attempting to blame it on two black men in a Milwaukee parking lot. Like Dahmer, he was despised by the other inmates for his crimes. The three men were left unsupervised in the gymnasium for approximately 20 minutes. That was all the time Christopher Scarver needed. What happened next was swift and brutal. Scarver grabbed a metal bar from the prison weight room and attacked both Dahmer and Anderson. The weapon was a 20-inch iron bar, heavy enough to crush a skull with a single blow. Scarver struck Dahmer first, hitting him in the head with such force that it fractured his skull in multiple places. The sound echoed through the empty gymnasium like a gunshot. Dahmer fell to the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. But Scarver wasn't finished. He continued to beat Dahmer with the metal bar, striking him again and again until his head was completely crushed. Then he turned his attention to Jesse Anderson, delivering the same savage beating before calmly walking away. Prison guards found both men lying unconscious in pools of their own blood. They were rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the attack. Jesse Anderson died 2 days later from his injuries. Christopher Scarver was immediately placed in solitary confinement. When questioned about the murders, he showed no remorse. He said he had been disgusted by Dahmer's behavior, by his apparent lack of remorse for his crimes. He claimed that God had told him to deliver justice where the legal system had failed. The news of Jeffrey Dahmer's death spread quickly. In Milwaukee, the reaction was mixed. Some family members of his victims felt a sense of relief, finally able to close a chapter that had haunted them for years. Others felt cheated, believing that Dahmer had escaped the full weight of his punishment by dying so quickly. Rita Isbell, the sister of victim Errol Lindsay, expressed her feelings to reporters. "I felt like I finally had closure. He couldn't hurt anyone else, and he couldn't continue to live off the taxpayers' money. Justice was finally served." But not everyone felt that way. Some family members had wanted Dahmer to live, to serve out his full sentence and think about what he'd done for decades. They felt that his death was too easy, too quick for someone who had caused so much pain and suffering. The prison administration faced immediate criticism for allowing the attack to happen. How could 3 inmates, including 2 of the most hated men in the facility, be left unsupervised for 20 minutes? Questions were raised about whether the guards had deliberately looked the other way, whether they had wanted this to happen. An investigation was launched, but it found no evidence of negligence or conspiracy. The official report concluded that it was a tragic failure of the prison system, a momentary lapse in security that had deadly consequences. Christopher Scarver was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 additional life terms. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer marked the end of one of the most horrific chapters in American criminal history, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about justice, about whether certain crimes are so heinous that they warrant vigilante punishment. In the twisted ecosystem of prison life, Christopher Scarver had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. Some saw Scarver as a hero, a man who had done what the legal system couldn't or wouldn't do. Others saw him as just another killer, no different from the men he had murdered. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. Jeffrey Dahmer died as he had lived, surrounded by violence and hatred, but his death didn't erase the horror of what he had done. It didn't bring back the 17 young men whose lives he had stolen. It didn't heal the trauma he had inflicted on their families and communities. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's story serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist within human beings. It shows us what happens when that darkness is allowed to grow unchecked, when warning signs are ignored, when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. The Milwaukee cannibal was gone, but the questions he left behind remained. How do we recognize evil before it strikes? How do we prevent another Jeffrey Dahmer from walking among us? And perhaps most importantly, how do we ensure that the victims are remembered not just as statistics in a horror story, but as real people with dreams, hopes, and families who loved them? These are the questions that continue to haunt us long after the monster himself has been silenced forever. By November 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer had been behind bars for nearly 3 years. The man who had terrorized Milwaukee, who had turned 17 young men into objects of his twisted fantasies, was now just another inmate in the Wisconsin correctional system. But the story wasn't over. In fact, the final chapter was about to be written in the most violent way possible. Prison life for Jeffrey Dahmer was unlike that of most inmates. From the moment he arrived at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, he was marked. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what he had done. The Milwaukee cannibal, the Milwaukee monster, the man who had drilled holes in living skulls and tried to create zombies. His crimes weren't just murder, they were an affront to human dignity itself. For his own protection, Dahmer was initially placed in solitary confinement. 23 hours a day in a small cell, alone with his thoughts and the weight of what he had done. He received hundreds of letters from around the world. Some were from people fascinated by his crimes, others from those who condemned him. He used the money that sympathetic strangers sent to buy cigarettes, magazines, and cassette tapes. It was a strange existence, isolated yet somehow connected to the outside world through these bizarre correspondences. But solitary confinement couldn't last forever. After a year, Dahmer requested to be moved to the general population. Prison officials, perhaps believing he had adapted to institutional life, granted his request. It was a decision that would prove fatal. He was assigned to work detail, cleaning toilets, and later the prison gymnasium. 2 hours a day, he would emerge from his cell and work alongside other inmates. It was during these periods that the danger was most acute. The other inmates hadn't forgotten what Dahmer represented. In a place where even hardened criminals had their own code of ethics, Dahmer's crimes against children and his acts of cannibalism marked him as the lowest of the low. Prison hierarchies are brutal and unforgiving. Child killers and cannibals occupy the bottom rung, and Jeffrey Dahmer was both. Among the inmates who worked the same detail was Christopher Scarver, a 25-year-old African-American man serving a life sentence for murder. Scarver had killed his boss in 1990 during a robbery, shooting him in the head with a sawed-off shotgun. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had a history of erratic behavior. But more importantly, Scarver harbored an intense hatred for Jeffrey Dahmer. In the twisted social dynamics of prison, Scarver had appointed himself as an instrument of justice. He was deeply religious and viewed Dahmer's crimes as an abomination that demanded punishment. The fact that many of Dahmer's victims were young black men added another layer to Scarver's animosity. He saw Dahmer not just as a killer, but as a racist predator who had specifically targeted vulnerable minorities. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work detail as usual. He was accompanied by Scarver and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, who was serving time for murdering his wife. Anderson had tried to blame his wife's death on two black men, a lie that had eventually been exposed. Like Dahmer, Anderson was despised by the other inmates for both his crime and his attempt to shift blame onto black men. The three men were tasked with cleaning the prison gymnasium. It should have been routine, just another day of institutional labor. But something was different that morning. The supervising guard, for reasons that were never fully explained, left the three men alone in the gym. It was a violation of protocol. High-risk inmates like Dahmer were supposed to be under constant supervision. But for 20 minutes, the three men were alone. What happened next was swift and brutal. Scarver later claimed that Dahmer had been taunting him, making jokes about his crimes, and even fashioning fake limbs out of prison food to mock his victims. Whether this was true or simply Scarver's justification for what followed, we'll never know. What we do know is that at approximately 8:10 a.m., Scarver snapped. He grabbed a 20-inch metal bar from the prison weight room and attacked. His first target was Jesse Anderson, whom he struck repeatedly in the head and face. Anderson fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Then Scarver turned his attention to Dahmer. The man who had killed 17 people, who had terrorized an entire city, who had become the embodiment of evil itself, was now facing his own violent end. Scarver brought the metal bar down on Dahmer's head with tremendous force. The blow was so severe that it crushed his skull and caused massive brain trauma. Dahmer collapsed immediately, his body convulsing as his brain began to shut down. Scarver continued to beat him, striking his head and body repeatedly until Dahmer lay motionless on the gymnasium floor. When guards finally arrived, they found a scene of carnage. Both Dahmer and Anderson were barely alive, their heads caved in and blood everywhere. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the attack began. Jesse Anderson died 2 days later from his injuries. Christopher Scarver was immediately placed in solitary confinement and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He showed no remorse for his actions. In fact, He seemed proud of what he had done. He told investigators that he had been chosen by God to carry out divine justice, that Dahmer's death was punishment for his unspeakable crimes. The news of Dahmer's death sent shockwaves through Milwaukee and across the nation. For the families of his victims, the reaction was mixed. Some felt that justice had finally been served, that Dahmer had received the punishment he deserved. Others worried that his death had denied them the opportunity to see him suffer through a lifetime of imprisonment. Rita Isbell, the sister of victim Errol Lindsay, said she felt cheated by Dahmer's death because it had come too quickly. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Dahmer's own father, Lionel. In the years following his son's crimes, Lionel had struggled to understand how the boy he had raised could have become such a monster. He had written a book about Jeffrey's childhood, searching for clues and warning signs that might have been missed. When Jeffrey was killed, Lionel expressed a complex mixture of grief and relief. His son was gone, but so was the constant reminder of the horror he had inflicted on so many families. The prison system faced intense scrutiny following Dahmer's death. How had 3 high-risk inmates been left alone together? Why wasn't there proper supervision? An investigation revealed multiple failures in protocol and security. The guard who had left his post was suspended, and new procedures were implemented to prevent similar incidents. Christopher Scarver was eventually convicted of the murders and sentenced to 2 additional life terms. He was transferred to a different prison, where he remains to this day. In interviews years later, he would claim that prison officials had deliberately set up the situation, knowing that he would likely attack Dahmer. Whether this was true or simply another delusion from a man with severe mental illness remains unclear. Jeffrey Dahmer's death marked the end of one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history, but his legacy lived on in the families he had destroyed, the community he had terrorized, and the questions he had raised about the nature of evil itself. His crimes had exposed the failures of law enforcement, the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities, and the depths of human depravity. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer died as he had lived in his final years, violently and without dignity. The man who had stripped his victims of their humanity, who had reduced them to objects for his twisted pleasure, met his own end at the hands of another killer. There was a certain symmetry to it, a closing of a circle that had begun with Stephen Hicks in 1978 and ended with Christopher Scarver's metal bar in 1994. The Milwaukee cannibal was dead, but the questions he raised about society, about mental illness, about the nature of evil itself, would linger long after his body was cremated and his ashes scattered in an undisclosed location. His story serves as a reminder that monsters are not born in isolation, but are created through a complex interplay of psychology, circumstance, and societal failure. And sometimes, those monsters meet their end not through the justice system, but through the violent code of the very world they helped create. On November 28, 1994, at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was going about his routine morning duties. He was mopping floors in the prison gymnasium alongside 2 other inmates when suddenly everything changed. Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate serving time for murder, had been watching Dahmer for weeks, growing increasingly agitated by his presence. That morning, Scarver grabbed a metal bar from the prison weight room and struck Dahmer twice in the head with devastating force. The blows were so severe that Dahmer was pronounced dead an hour later at a nearby hospital. His reign of terror had finally come to an end, but not through the justice system or natural causes. It ended through the brutal violence of another killer. Christopher Scarver later claimed that he had been disgusted by Dahmer's crimes and disturbed by his behavior in prison. Dahmer had a habit of shaping his food into grotesque forms that resembled severed limbs, using ketchup as fake blood to recreate his crimes. He would leave these disturbing displays around the prison, taunting other inmates and guards with reminders of his horrific acts. Scarver said he couldn't stand watching Dahmer mock his victims and their families any longer. The attack wasn't random or impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and final. The news of Dahmer's death sent shockwaves through the media and the public. Some saw it as justice served, a fitting end for a man who had caused so much pain and suffering. Others viewed it as a failure of the prison system to protect all inmates, regardless of their crimes. The families of Dahmer's victims had mixed reactions. Some felt relief that he could never hurt anyone again, while others had hoped he would live long enough to provide more answers about their loved ones' final moments. Prison officials launched an investigation into how Scarver had managed to obtain the weapon and carry out the attack. They discovered that security protocols had been relaxed, and the 3 inmates had been left unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes. This lapse in security cost Dahmer his life and raised serious questions about prison safety and management. The incident led to significant changes in how high-profile inmates were housed and supervised. But Dahmer's death didn't end the story. If anything, it added another layer of complexity to an already disturbing case. The man who had taken so many lives through calculated violence had himself become the victim of calculated violence. There was a dark irony in how his story ended, killed by someone who, like him, had taken a life and felt justified in their actions. Scarver believed he was delivering justice that the system had failed to provide. The impact of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes extended far beyond his death. His case became a reference point for discussions about mental health, criminal justice, and the warning signs of violent behavior. Criminologists and psychologists studied his case extensively, trying to understand how someone could commit such horrific acts and what might have been done to prevent them. His childhood fascination with death and violence, his isolation, his untreated mental health issues, and the failure of multiple systems to intervene became lessons for future prevention efforts. The families of his victims continued to struggle with their loss and trauma long after his death. Many felt that justice had never truly been served, that no punishment could ever match the horror of what their loved ones had endured. Some found solace in advocacy work, pushing for better support systems for families of murder victims and improvements in law enforcement's handling of missing persons cases, particularly those involving marginalized communities. The case also highlighted significant issues with how law enforcement treated crimes against minority communities. The majority of Dahmer's victims were young Black, Latino, and Asian men, many of whom came from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Their disappearances weren't always taken seriously by police, and their families often felt ignored by the system. The Konarak Synthosomophone incident, where police returned the drugged and disoriented boy to Dahmer, became a symbol of systemic racism and negligence that cost lives. In the years following his death, Dahmer's case continued to fascinate and horrify the public. Books were written, documentaries were made, and his story became part of the cultural conversation about evil and human nature. But this attention often came at the cost of remembering his victims as individuals with their own stories, dreams, and loved ones who mourned their loss. The apartment building where Dahmer committed most of his crimes was eventually demolished. The site became a symbol of the community's desire to move forward and heal from the trauma that had occurred there. But the memories remained, embedded in the collective consciousness of Milwaukee and the nation. The case served as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that monsters can live among us undetected for years. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is ultimately one of failure on multiple levels. It's the failure of a troubled child to receive the help he needed, the failure of systems to protect vulnerable individuals, the failure of society to recognize and address the warning signs of extreme violence, and the failure of justice to provide closure for the victims' families. His death in prison marked the end of his physical presence in the world, but the questions his case raised about human nature, mental illness, and societal responsibility continue to resonate today. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer in 1994 marked the end of one of America's most disturbing criminal cases, but it certainly did not mark the end of the questions his crimes raised about our society, our institutions, and ourselves. In the decades since his death, Dahmer's case has continued to reverberate through popular culture, academic study, and public discourse, serving as a dark mirror that reflects our deepest fears about human nature and our collective failures to protect the vulnerable. The immediate aftermath of Dahmer's crimes forced Milwaukee and the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic discrimination and institutional negligence. The fact that many of his victims were young men of color, often from marginalized communities, highlighted how society's most vulnerable populations can become invisible to those sworn to protect them. The missed opportunities for intervention, from the encounters with police to the complaints from neighbors that went unheeded, revealed a pattern of indifference that had deadly consequences. Law enforcement agencies across the country were forced to examine their own practices and biases. The incident involving Konarak Synthasamphone, the 14-year-old boy who was returned to Dahmer by police officers who failed to properly investigate the situation, became a catalyst for changes in police training and protocols. It underscored the critical importance of thorough investigation, cultural sensitivity, and the dangers of making assumptions based on race, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. The case also sparked intense debate within the mental health community about the nature of evil, the treatment of severe personality disorders, and the intersection of mental illness with criminal behavior. While Dahmer was found legally sane, his actions clearly indicated profound psychological disturbance. This paradox challenged traditional notions of sanity and responsibility, forcing professionals to grapple with questions about whether such extreme behavior could ever be truly understood or prevented. Dahmer's claims of religious conversion in prison added another layer of complexity to his legacy. Some viewed his apparent embrace of Christianity as genuine remorse and a search for redemption, while others saw it as another manipulation by a man who had spent his life deceiving those around him. This debate touched on fundamental questions about forgiveness, redemption, and whether someone who had committed such heinous acts could ever truly change. The families of Dahmer's victims have carried an unimaginable burden of grief and loss. Many have become advocates for victims' rights, working to ensure that the voices of those who were silenced are not forgotten. Their strength in the face of such tragedy has been a source of inspiration and has helped to humanize the victims beyond the horrific circumstances of their deaths. They have reminded us that behind every statistic, every case file, and every sensational headline, there are real people whose lives were cut short and families left to mourn. The media's coverage of the Dahmer case raised important questions about the ethics of true crime reporting and the fine line between public interest and sensationalism. The intense focus on the gruesome details of his crimes sometimes overshadowed the human cost and the systemic failures that allowed them to continue. This has led to ongoing discussions about responsible journalism and the impact of graphic content on both victims' families and society at large. In the years since Dahmer's death, advances in forensic science, criminal profiling, and investigative techniques have made it more difficult for serial killers to operate undetected for extended periods. The lessons learned from cases like Dahmer's have contributed to improved training for law enforcement, better communication between agencies, and more sophisticated methods of identifying and tracking potential threats. Yet despite these advances, the fundamental questions raised by Dahmer's case remain as relevant today as they were 30 years ago. How do we identify and help troubled individuals before they become dangerous? How do we protect society's most vulnerable members? How do we balance the rights of the accused with the safety of the community? These questions have no easy answers, but they demand our continued attention and commitment. The Jeffrey Dahmer case serves as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. His neighbors described him as quiet and unremarkable. His co-workers saw him as a regular guy who showed up to work and did his job. This ordinariness is perhaps the most chilling aspect of his story, because it forces us to confront the possibility that such darkness could be lurking anywhere, behind any door, in any community. As we look back on this case, we must resist the temptation to view Dahmer as some sort of monster separate from humanity. While his actions were undeniably monstrous, he was a human being who made choices, terrible choices that cost 17 people their lives. Understanding this distinction is crucial if we hope to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Jeffrey Dahmer case stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history, but its significance extends far beyond the horrific crimes themselves. His story serves as a stark reminder of how societal failures, systemic prejudices, and missed opportunities can allow evil to flourish unchecked. The 17 young men who lost their lives were not just statistics, they were sons, brothers, and friends whose potential was stolen by one man's uncontrollable compulsions. The case exposed critical flaws in law enforcement practices, particularly regarding how marginalized communities were treated. The racial bias and homophobia that allowed Dahmer to operate for so long forced uncomfortable conversations about justice and equality. These revelations led to important reforms in police procedures and victim advocacy protocols that continue to influence law enforcement today. Perhaps most unsettling is how Dahmer's outward normalcy masked such profound darkness. His ability to maintain a facade of ordinary life while committing unspeakable acts challenges our assumptions about recognizing danger. This case underscores the importance of early intervention for troubled individuals and the need for robust mental health resources. As we remember Jeffrey Dahmer, we must center the victims and their families rather than sensationalizing the killer. Their stories deserve to be told with dignity and respect. The legacy of this case should be a commitment to protecting the vulnerable, addressing systemic inequalities, and ensuring that such failures never happen again. Only through understanding these dark chapters can we work toward a more just and vigilant society.